Maya Thompson stepped into Jefferson High School's hallway on Monday morning, her new braids neatly styled after spending the weekend at her aunt's salon. Each geometric pattern was meticulously crafted, representing both style and cultural heritage. The familiar buzz of fluorescent lights and morning chatter filled the corridor as she made her way to first period advanced English. Ms. Linda Johnson's classroom fell quiet as Maya entered. The veteran teacher's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she tracked Maya's movement. Before Maya could reach her desk, Ms. Johnson's sharp voice cut through the silence. "Miss Thompson, I see you've chosen to make quite a statement with your hair. While I appreciate creative expression, this is an academic environment. Perhaps something more professional would be appropriate." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Her fingers instinctively touched her braids as 27 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The confidence she'd felt that morning evaporated. She slid into her seat, keeping her expression neutral despite the heat rising in her cheeks. After class, Maya's friends gathered around her locker. Jessica Chen, her best friend since middle school, was furious. "She had no right to say that. Your braids are beautiful, and they're part of your culture. You should report her." "I don't know," Amber Martinez chimed in, twirling her straight brown hair. "Ms. Johnson's old school, but maybe she has a point about professional standards. My mom says we need to learn to fit in for the real world." Maya stood silent, her hand resting on her locker door. The contrasting opinions of her friends echoed the conflict she felt inside. Part of her wanted to stand up for herself, to explain the cultural significance of her hairstyle. Another part wanted to avoid conflict, to not draw attention to herself as one of the few black students in advanced placement classes. That evening, Maya sat at her family's dinner table, pushing food around her plate. Her father, Judge Marcus Thompson, noticed her unusual quietness. "Everything okay, sweetheart? You've barely touched your mother's lasagna." Maya considered telling him about Ms. Johnson's comments. Her father had built his career fighting discrimination, rising to become one of the most respected judges in the state. One word from him would probably end the whole situation. But that was exactly what worried her. If her father got involved, everyone would know. She'd become the judge's daughter who couldn't handle a simple comment about her hair. The whispers would be worse than Ms. Johnson's criticism. "Just tired, Dad," Maya replied, forcing a smile. Big test coming up. As she lay in bed that night, Maya stared at her ceiling, thoughts racing. Tomorrow she'd have to face Ms. Johnson again. The teacher's words played on repeat in her mind. Something more professional. Maya touched her braids, feeling the intricate patterns beneath her fingers. These braids connected her to generations of women in her family, to a heritage that survived centuries of pressure to conform. Yet here she was, in 2024, still facing the same old prejudices, just wrapped in different words. How long could she keep this inner conflict from her father? And what would it mean for her if she did speak up? These questions followed Maya into an uneasy sleep, while her clock ticked steadily toward another school day. The announcement of Judge Marcus Thompson's upcoming speech at Jefferson High spread through the school like wildfire. The assembly hall buzzed with anticipation as students whispered about having a federal judge address them about equality and justice. Maya sat in the back of her history class, hearing classmates discuss her father without realizing his connection to her. "I heard he handled that big discrimination case last year," one student whispered. "My dad says he's the most progressive judge in the circuit," another added. Ms. Johnson stood at her desk, gripping a stack of papers so tightly her knuckles whitened. She'd just learned from the principal that the guest speaker was Maya Thompson's father. The revelation hit her like ice water. Her recent comments about Maya's hair now felt like a potential career-ending mistake. She'd criticized the appearance of a federal judge's daughter, and not just any judge, one known for his stance on cultural discrimination. During her free period, Linda Johnson frantically researched Judge Thompson's cases. Each article she read made her stomach sink further. He had ruled on multiple discrimination cases, including ones involving cultural expression in professional settings. Her professional standards argument suddenly seemed painfully outdated and potentially discriminatory. The day of the speech arrived with a nervous energy permeating the school halls. Judge Thompson stood at the podium, commanding respect in his tailored suit. Maya sat in the front row, a mix of pride and anxiety churning in her stomach. She watched Ms. Johnson slip into the back of the auditorium, trying to make herself invisible. "Justice isn't just about laws," Marcus Thompson began, his voice filling the space. "It's about recognizing and respecting the dignity of every individual. Our differences, whether they're cultural, racial, or personal, aren't obstacles to overcome. They're strengths to embrace." Maya felt her chest tighten as her father continued. Every word seemed to address her situation, though he had no idea what had happened. She noticed several students turning to look at her, making connections they hadn't before. The whispers started. "That's his daughter? No wonder her hair always looks so nice." Ms. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Judge Thompson discussed recent cases of discrimination in educational settings. "Sometimes," he said, "prejudice hides behind words like professional or appropriate. But who defines these terms? And why do these definitions often exclude certain cultural expressions?" The assembly hall fell silent. Maya could see the impact of her father's words on her classmates' faces. Even the teachers seemed deep in thought. Ms. Johnson had slumped slightly in her chair, her face pale. After the speech, students crowded around Judge Thompson, asking questions about his cases and career. Maya stood to the side, watching her father engage with her peers. She felt a strange mix of emotions: pride in her father's accomplishments, anxiety about her own situation, and a growing certainty that she needed to tell him about what happened. Ms. Johnson slipped out of the assembly hall before anyone could notice, heading straight to her classroom. She sat at her desk, mind racing. How could she justify her comments about Maya's hair now? What if Judge Thompson found out? The professional reputation she'd built over 20 years felt suddenly fragile. Ms. Johnson watched through her classroom window as students gathered around Judge Thompson in the courtyard. The admiration in their faces was unmistakable, and for the first time in her 20-year teaching career, she felt fundamentally wrong about her approach to discipline and standards. She observed a group of students showing the judge their various cultural hairstyles and accessories. His genuine interest and respectful questions made her own recent comments to Maya seem even more inappropriate. The memory of Maya's face falling after her criticism replayed in her mind, now colored by a new understanding. Linda pulled out her lesson plans, staring at notes about maintaining professional standards and proper classroom appearance. Words she'd used for years now seemed loaded with unexamined prejudice. She began crossing out sections, her red pen slashing through phrases she'd never questioned before. Meanwhile, Maya finally gathered her courage. She found her father still surrounded by admirers, but managed to catch his eye. "Dad, can we talk? Privately?" They walked to an empty classroom, Maya's heart pounding. The familiar smell of chalk dust and old textbooks filled the air as she closed the door behind them. "There's something I need to tell you about Ms. Johnson." Marcus Thompson listened intently as Maya described the incident with her braids. His expression remained neutral, but Maya noticed his jaw tightening, a telltale sign of his controlled anger. She explained how the comment made her feel, how she'd struggled with whether to tell him, and how other students had divided opinions on the matter. "I didn't want to be the judge's daughter, making a big deal out of nothing," Maya finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "But after hearing your speech today..." Marcus placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Maya, this isn't nothing. What Ms. Johnson did was textbook discrimination. wrapped in the guise of professional standards. You had every right to tell me immediately." He pulled out his phone and dialed the principal's office. "Ms. Reynolds, this is Judge Thompson. I need to discuss an urgent matter regarding cultural discrimination in your school." "Yes, it involves my daughter." "No, this can't wait until tomorrow." Principal Reynolds cleared her schedule immediately. Within minutes, Maya and her father sat across from her desk while she listened with growing concern. The principal's usual composed demeanor cracked as she realized the legal implications of Ms. Johnson's actions. "I assure you, Judge Thompson, we take these matters very seriously," Principal Reynolds said, reaching for her internal policy handbook. "Our school's mission statement explicitly promotes cultural diversity and inclusion. Actions speak louder than mission statements," Marcus replied firmly. "What concrete steps will you take to address this systematic issue?" The principal began outlining potential solutions. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training for staff, revised dress code policies, student-led diversity initiatives. But Marcus interrupted her list of bureaucratic solutions. "These are good starting points," he acknowledged. "But what about the immediate impact on students like Maya? How do we ensure they feel safe and respected in their classrooms tomorrow?" Maya watched this exchange with mixed emotions. Part of her felt relieved that action would be taken, while another part worried about the backlash. Would Ms. Johnson retaliate? Would other teachers treat her differently? Would her classmates resent her for causing trouble? The meeting concluded with Principal Reynolds promising immediate action. As they left her office, Maya noticed Ms. Johnson watching from her classroom doorway, her face pale and uncertain. Their eyes met briefly before the teacher quickly looked away. The school auditorium filled quickly for the emergency parent-teacher meeting. Parents settled into squeaky plastic chairs while teachers lined the walls, their faces tense. Principal Reynolds stood at the podium, flanked by Judge Thompson and the school board president. Ms. Johnson sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We're here to address recent concerns about cultural sensitivity in our classrooms," Principal Reynolds began. "Specifically, an incident involving discriminatory comments about a student's cultural hairstyle." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some parents exchanged knowing looks, while others appeared confused. Maya sat between her parents, feeling every eye in the room occasionally drift toward her braids. Ms. Johnson rose when called upon, her voice shakier than her usual confident classroom tone. "I want to clarify that my comments were purely about maintaining professional standards in an academic setting. We have a responsibility to prepare students for the professional world." The explanation sparked immediate reaction. A black parent stood up. "And who decides what's professional? My daughter wears her hair in braids at her engineering firm." Another parent countered, "Teachers should have authority over classroom standards." The room quickly divided into heated discussions. Judge Thompson raised his hand for silence. "The issue isn't about classroom authority. It's about discriminatory practices disguised as professional standards. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 explicitly prohibits discrimination based on race, which includes cultural expressions like hairstyles." Ms. Johnson's attempt to defend herself grew more desperate. "I've been teaching for 20 years. My methods have always focused on preparing students for success. If we don't teach them to conform to professional standards..." "Conform?" A voice cut through the tension. Sarah Chen, a quiet junior known for her perfect attendance and high grades, stood up. "I've spent years trying to conform, straightening my hair, hiding my cultural accessories, even changing how I speak. But watching Maya proud of her braids made me realize we shouldn't have to hide who we are." The room fell silent as Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "I propose we create a student diversity council, a place where we can discuss these issues openly and educate others about our cultures. Maybe, if we had this before, Ms. Johnson would have understood why her comments were hurtful." Other students began raising their hands, eager to support Sarah's suggestion. Principal Reynolds nodded approvingly, quickly writing notes. Even some parents who had initially seemed skeptical began nodding in agreement. Ms. Johnson sank further into her chair as more students shared similar experiences. Stories of feeling pressured to change their appearance, hide their cultural identities, or stay silent about microaggressions poured out. Each testimony made her professional standards argument sound more outdated and harmful. The meeting stretched past its scheduled time as more people wanted to speak. Principal Reynolds finally called for order, announcing the immediate formation of a diversity council and mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff. She also promised a complete review of the school's dress code and disciplinary policies. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached Maya. "Thank you for being brave enough to speak up. Your situation helped us all find our voice." Maya watched Ms. Johnson hurry out of the auditorium, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The teacher's rapid exit marked a clear shift in the power dynamic that had defined their relationship until now. Maya's idea for a cultural celebration event spread through Jefferson High like a spark in dry grass. Students from different backgrounds began approaching her between classes, eager to share their traditions and participate. The once quiet hallways now buzzed with planning discussions and excited chatter about cultural performances. The event would transform the school gymnasium into a global village, with booths representing different cultures, traditional performances, and food sharing. Maya worked with Sarah and other newly vocal students to coordinate the logistics, their shared purpose bridging social groups that rarely mixed before. Ms. Johnson observed these changes from the margins of school life. Her usual commanding presence in the hallways had diminished to quick, nervous walks between classes. When she passed Maya in the corridor, she attempted a smile that came across as more of a grimace. Maya responded with a polite nod, neither hostile nor friendly. "Miss Thompson," Ms. Johnson called out one afternoon, her voice lacking its former authority. "Could we discuss the recent events?" Maya felt her shoulders tense. "I'm late for a planning meeting," she replied, continuing down the hallway. The interaction left both of them uncomfortable. Ms. Johnson standing alone by her classroom door, Maya hurrying away with a mix of guilt and satisfaction. The tension spread beyond their personal interactions. The faculty lounge had become divided, with younger teachers enthusiastically supporting the cultural event, while older staff members clustered around Ms. Johnson, muttering about maintaining standards and pandering to pressure. Meanwhile, the school transformed. Students hung posters featuring traditional clothing and hairstyles from various cultures. Display cases previously reserved for sports trophies now showcased cultural artifacts borrowed from students' families. The change was visible and unstoppable. Principal Reynolds supported the initiative, but watched the growing division with concern. She caught Ms. Johnson after a staff meeting. "Linda, you need to find a way to participate positively in these changes. Your resistance is being noticed." Ms. Johnson stood in her empty classroom that afternoon, surrounded by the educational posters she'd used for years, all featuring a notably uniform representation of professional appearance. For the first time, she really saw what her students had been trying to tell her. Maya and her team worked through lunch periods and after school, transforming their vision into reality. Students who had previously minimized their cultural differences now proudly shared family traditions. A Korean student demonstrated traditional hair accessories, while a Moroccan student taught others about henna designs. The growing excitement highlighted Ms. Johnson's isolation. Students who once competed for her attention now avoided eye contact. Her classroom, previously a hub of academic activity, felt increasingly like an island of outdated thinking in a sea of change. As the event approached, the division became more pronounced. Ms. Johnson overheard students discussing her in whispers. "Did you hear what she said about Maya's hair? My older sister had her last year. She made Rachel feel bad about her hijab too. These whispered conversations forced Ms. Johnson to confront a pattern in her behavior she'd never acknowledged. Each night, she left school feeling more displaced in the institution she'd once considered her second home. The morning of the cultural celebration arrived with a burst of energy. Students streamed into school carrying traditional clothing, decorations, and covered dishes. The gymnasium, usually echoing with basketball bounces and whistle blows, transformed into a vibrant tapestry of global cultures. Maya stood in the center of the chaos, clipboard in hand, directing traffic. Her own booth, celebrating African American hair culture, featured photographs spanning centuries, from traditional African styles to modern interpretations. Her aunt, the hairstylist, had helped create visual demonstrations of braiding techniques. "Maya, the sound system's acting up," Sarah called from the stage area. "And the Vietnamese dance group needs more space for their fan dance." Maya moved between issues with growing confidence, no longer the hesitant student who'd once worried about drawing attention to herself. In her classroom, Ms. Johnson graded papers, the sounds of preparation echoing down the hall. She'd been asked to supervise the event, but had submitted a request for personal leave instead. Principal Reynolds had denied it, noting the importance of full staff participation. The first presentation began at noon. Amara Hassan, a quiet sophomore, took the stage in her traditional Somali dress. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke about her experiences wearing a hijab in America. "Last year, a teacher suggested I remove my hijab during volleyball practice to fit in better with the team," Amara revealed. "I quit the team instead. Today, I want to explain what my hijab means to me, why it's not just a piece of cloth that can be removed for convenience." The gymnasium fell silent. In the back, Ms. Johnson felt her face flush, remembering similar, helpful suggestions she'd given to students over the years. She watched as students and teachers wiped tears during Amara's speech, saw the nodding heads and supportive smiles. Other presentations followed. A Chinese student demonstrated traditional calligraphy while explaining how he'd been mocked for bringing weird lunches to school. A Mexican-American student shared how she'd been told her quinceañera crown was too flashy for yearbook photos. Each story hit Ms. Johnson like a physical blow. These weren't just isolated incidents. They formed a pattern of cultural suppression she'd been part of. From her position at the back of the gym, she watched students she'd taught for years reveal pain she'd never recognized. The event continued throughout the afternoon. Parents began arriving, adding their own stories and traditions to the mix. Maya's father stood proudly by her booth, engaging visitors in discussions about the historical significance of Black hairstyles and their protection under civil rights law. Ms. Johnson found herself drawn to the presentations despite her initial resistance. She observed students she'd labeled as problematic or unprofessional, leading sophisticated discussions about their heritage. Their confidence and articulateness challenged every assumption she'd held about appropriate student behavior. As the day progressed, the atmosphere shifted from presentation to celebration. Students moved between booths, trying new foods, learning traditional dances, and sharing stories. The walls between social groups seemed to dissolve, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. The cultural celebration reached its peak as the afternoon sun streamed through the gymnasium windows. Students and parents crowded around each booth, the air filled with multiple languages, music, and the aroma of diverse foods. Success radiated from every corner of the space. Ms. Johnson lingered near the exit, watching her students move confidently through the crowd. They were poised, articulate, and professional, but not in the narrow way she'd always defined the term. They demonstrated a kind of professionalism that embraced rather than erased their cultural identities. Principal Reynolds took notes throughout the event, clearly impressed by the level of organization and engagement. She observed how naturally students switched between languages, helping parents understand different presentations, building bridges between communities that rarely interacted outside school walls. Maya approached the podium for her closing speech, her braids adorned with traditional beads that caught the light. The gymnasium fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. Ms. Johnson, despite her instinct to leave, found herself rooted to the spot. "When I was told my hair wasn't professional enough for school," Maya began, her voice steady, "I felt ashamed, not just of my hair but of letting someone make me question my identity." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But look around this room. Look at the beautiful traditions we've been hiding. Look at what happens when we stop trying to fit into someone else's definition of appropriate." The crowd erupted in applause. Parents wiped tears, teachers nodded in recognition, and students cheered. Ms. Johnson stood alone, the weight of Maya's words settling heavily on her shoulders. Each clap felt like an indictment of her past actions. "Our differences aren't distractions," Maya continued. "They're not obstacles to overcome. They're strengths to celebrate. Today proves that we can be excellent students, maintain high academic standards, and still honor who we are." More applause followed. Principal Reynolds made her way to the podium, beaming with pride. "What we've witnessed today goes beyond cultural celebration," she announced. "This is the future of education, inclusive, respectful, and enriching for everyone." The crowd's enthusiasm was infectious, spreading through the gymnasium like a wave. Everyone, it seemed, felt part of something momentous. Everyone except Ms. Johnson, who remained isolated in her corner, increasingly aware of her role as the catalyst for this transformation, though not in the way she'd ever intended. Students began spontaneously sharing their experiences about the day. The Korean dancing group talked about their initial hesitation to perform and their current pride. The Muslim students' booth had run out of hijabs after so many wanted to learn about their significance. Even the cafeteria staff praised the experience of serving traditional dishes from different cultures. Ms. Johnson watched her carefully constructed world of proper academic standards crumble in the face of this vibrant reality. Her isolation felt complete as she observed former teacher allies now enthusiastically participating in the celebration, leaving her as the sole representative of an outdated perspective. The day after the cultural celebration, Ms. Johnson sat alone in the school library during her free period, surrounded by books she'd pulled from the multicultural education section. Titles about cultural competency, inclusive education, and dismantling systemic bias formed towers on her table, evidence of her private struggle to understand where she'd gone wrong. Her reading was interrupted by fragments of student conversations floating between the shelves. "Did you see Ms. Johnson at the celebration? She just stood there like a statue. My sister said she used to make comments about her accent too." Each whispered observation pushed her deeper into her research. She began taking notes, documenting instances where her professional standards had actually been thinly veiled discrimination. The list grew longer than she'd expected. Comments about ethnic hairstyles, suggestions to tone down cultural dress, corrections of students' accents. 20 years of teaching suddenly looked very different through this new lens. Meanwhile, Maya noticed these changes in her teacher. She saw Ms. Johnson in the library during lunch, watched her writing in a notebook while reading about cultural diversity. Part of her wanted to maintain her distance, to let the teacher stew in her isolation. But another part recognized something familiar in Ms. Johnson's struggle, the same uncertainty Maya had felt about her own identity. During passing period, Ms. Johnson found a note in her faculty mailbox. "If you'd like to talk, I'll be in room 203 after school. Maya Thompson." The teacher held the note, her hands trembling slightly. It was more than she deserved. this chance at dialogue. After the final bell, Ms. Johnson stood outside room 203, gathering her courage. Through the door's window, she could see Maya sitting at a desk, homework spread out before her. The roles felt reversed. Now she was the one afraid to enter a classroom. Maya looked up as the door opened. "Ms. Johnson," she acknowledged, her voice neutral. "Please, sit down." The teacher lowered herself into a student desk, acutely aware of the power shift in this interaction. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Ms. Johnson began, her voice lacking its usual authority. "And reading. I never wanted to—" She stopped, reorganizing her thoughts. "I'm sorry, Maya. That's the simplest way to say it. I was wrong." Maya studied her teacher's face, seeing past the professional mask to the uncertainty beneath. "Why did my braids bother you so much?" she asked directly. "What made you think you had the right to comment on my appearance?" Ms. Johnson's prepared responses disappeared in the face of Maya's direct question. For the first time in her career, she had to examine her own biases openly, with one of the students she'd hurt sitting right in front of her. Ms. Johnson's public apology came during a morning assembly. Standing before the entire school community, she struggled to maintain her composure as she acknowledged her discriminatory behavior. "I've spent 20 years teaching standards that I never questioned," she admitted. "Standards that, I now realize, were rooted in cultural bias and prejudice." The auditorium remained silent, students and staff watching as the usually confident teacher voiced her regrets. Maya sat in the front row, her father beside her, both maintaining neutral expressions as Ms. Johnson continued her address. "My comments about Maya Thompson's hair were not isolated incidents," she confessed. "They were part of a pattern of behavior that hurt many students over the years. I failed to recognize and respect the cultural identities of those in my care, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Following the assembly, Judge Thompson announced his involvement in developing a new diversity program for the school. Working with Principal Reynolds, he outlined a comprehensive plan that included regular cultural awareness training, curriculum revisions, and student-led initiatives. However, not everyone welcomed these changes. A group of parents, led by local business owner Richard Parker, began circulating emails questioning the need for such radical changes to school policy. They argued that traditional standards were being abandoned in favor of what they called political correctness. "Ms. Johnson was just doing her job," Parker argued during a heated PTA meeting. "Now we're throwing away 20 years of excellence because some students got their feelings hurt? This is ridiculous." The opposition grew more organized. Petitions circulated demanding Ms. Johnson's reinstatement to full teaching duties, as she'd been temporarily assigned to administrative tasks during the transition period. Letters to the school board questioned the legal necessity of the new diversity programs. Principal Reynolds found herself navigating increasingly turbulent waters. While many supported the changes, the vocal minority of opponents created significant pressure. "We need to find a balance," she told her staff during an emergency meeting. "But we cannot and will not return to discriminatory practices." Ms. Johnson watched these developments from her temporary office, processing student records while her classroom was covered by a substitute. Each complaint in her defense made her more uncomfortable, especially as she recognized the same biased thinking she'd recently acknowledged in herself. The tension reached a breaking point when Parker's group threatened legal action, claiming the new policies discriminated against traditional values. Judge Thompson, however, stood firm. "Traditional values cannot be a cover for discrimination," he stated during a school board meeting. "The law is clear on this." Maya found herself at the center of a controversy she hadn't asked for. Some students whose parents supported Ms. Johnson began avoiding her in the hallways. Others sought her out, sharing their own stories of discrimination and asking for advice. The school became increasingly divided. Teachers carefully watched their words in class, some overcompensating in their attempts to appear culturally sensitive. others quietly resistant to the changes. The initial unity of the cultural celebration seemed in danger of unraveling under the pressure of adult politics. The final school board meeting drew an unprecedented crowd. The gymnasium, still bearing traces of the cultural celebration banners, filled with parents, teachers, and students. Security guards stood at the entrances, a testament to the tension surrounding the evening's decisions. Judge Marcus Thompson sat with the board members, his judicial experience lending gravity to the proceedings. Maya watched from the front row as Richard Parker's group filed in, their "Support Ms. Johnson" buttons glinting under the fluorescent lights. Principal Reynolds opened the meeting with a comprehensive presentation of the year's events, from the initial incident with Maya's braids to the successful cultural celebration. She detailed both the positive changes and the growing community divide. "We're not here to judge Ms. Johnson as a person," Judge Thompson began his address, "but to evaluate whether our educational environment serves all students equally. The evidence suggests it has not." Ms. Johnson, seated in the middle section, listened as parents from both sides presented their arguments. Parker's group emphasized her teaching record and academic results. Others shared stories of their children feeling pressured to abandon cultural expressions to succeed in her class. When Maya's turn came to speak, she surprised everyone by defending Ms. Johnson, but not in the way Parker's group expected. "Ms. Johnson made a mistake," she acknowledged, "but her willingness to learn from it, to change, and to apologize publicly shows more character than those who continue defending discriminatory practices." The board's decision came after 3 hours of testimony. Ms. Johnson would not return to classroom teaching that year, but would instead help develop and implement the new Cultural Competency Program, working alongside diversity educators to transform her experience into a teaching tool. Parker's group stormed out in protest, but their dramatic exit felt hollow against the quiet dignity of the proceedings. The majority of the community stayed, ready to discuss implementation details for the new policies. In the parking lot afterward, Ms. Johnson approached Maya and her father. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your words tonight, they meant everything." Maya nodded, understanding that this moment marked a real transformation, not just for Ms. Johnson, but for the entire school community. The incident that began with criticism of her braids had catalyzed necessary changes in their educational system. As families departed, Principal Reynolds watched from the gymnasium entrance. Students chatted across cultural lines that had seemed impossible to bridge months earlier. Teachers discussed plans for incorporating diverse perspectives into their lessons. The following Monday, Maya walked into school wearing her braids with renewed confidence. Ms. Johnson, now working from the guidance office, offered a genuine smile as they passed in the hallway. Both understood that their conflict had evolved into something larger than themselves, a lesson in growth, change, and the ongoing work of building a truly inclusive community. The last bell of the year would ring soon, but the changes set in motion would continue reshaping Jefferson High. Maya's braids had become more than a hairstyle. They were a symbol of the power of standing up for one's identity and the possibility of transformation through understanding and respect.